On this episode of Newt's World, Ken Timmerman is a former war correspondent and investigative reporter who received a knock on his door and a request. Was he willing to help the U.S. government in its war against international terrorism? He agreed. At the time, he was talking to people the United States government could not talk to, and they wanted his access. So for many years, and for multiple agencies, he became an agent runner. In his new book, The Iran House, Tales of Revolution, Persecution, War and Intrigue, he reveals his deepest secrets about Iran, Israel, and U.S. intelligence operations on the ground and often in harm's way. With the recent killing of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, by the Israelis, this conversation is very timely. So I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Ken Timmerman. He is a former war correspondent, investigative reporter, human rights advocate, pro-freedom activist. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is currently a senior fellow in the Center for American Security at America First Policy Institute. Ken, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thanks for having me on, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Before we dive into your new book, I just wanted to ask you to chat a little bit about, your life. I mean, you have really led quite a life.
Well, and Mr. Speaker, I owe a particular personal debt to you because you were the one who made me see the light, although I had never met you, and become a Republican in 1994. I had come back from many years of living overseas and came back to work for Tom Lantos on the Hill. And I thought I was a Democrat, but I didn't understand why all my friends on the Hill were Republicans. And one morning at 2 o'clock, I couldn't sleep. 2 o'clock in the morning, I turned on C-SPAN, and there you were giving a lecture about American history. And I said, wow, here's the man who's supposed to have horns on his head, like many people say about me these days as well. And no, he's the most rational person I've ever heard. It was wonderful. So you were the final nail that got me to become a Republican. I've never regretted it one day, Mr. Speaker, so thank you.
Well, thank you. And you brought up a great memory. Tom Lantos was a great member. You had a pretty good introduction to Congress if you were working for Lantos. But you've ended up as a reporter doing a wide range of really interesting things before you got to the Hill. Talk about the whole process of the places you were covering and what the evolution of the Middle East as you see it.
Well, I started out in 1982 as a young man living in Paris with a novel in my suitcase and finally realized I had to grow up. Wound up getting a stringer's job going to Beirut to cover the 1982 war. 1982, the first Israeli invasion that got up to Beirut. I was a friend of the Palestinians. I was anti-Israeli. I was a left-wing, left bank intellectual in Paris. And I promptly got taken hostage by the Palestinians, who I thought I so loved, and held hostage for 24 days in a cellar in Beirut where they nearly killed me. And I came to my Savior, came to Jesus at that time in the cellar. He literally brought me out of the darkness into the light. I would not be here today. And in all the times that I've been covering really dicey situations, whether it's at 13,000 feet altitude along the border between Iran and Iraq in the Kandil Mountains, or when the Iranian Revolutionary Guard squads have been out gunning for me in northern Iraq. And I've always known that the Lord's got a plan for me, and I don't think is to die that particular way. I could have died in Beirut as a young guy, and he saved me for something, and I'm here to bear witness to that.
What was it like back in that period to be held hostage for 24 days?
Well, it wasn't a lot of fun. And I joked afterwards with the Israelis and a room full of reporters when the reporters, of course, were telling the IDF, well, you were engaged in indiscriminate bombing of the Palestinians in Beirut. That was the claim then, is the claim today. Nothing new under the sun. And I raised my hand and I said, well, actually, Colonel, I can attest to all these people here. It was not indiscriminate. I was being held within 100 meters of the sports stadium underground. And that's where all the Palestinian AAA artillery was, all of their anti-air guns at that time. They didn't have modern air defenses. And you just showed that gun footage, that gun camera footage, all your bombs landed within 100 meters. I was within that 100-meter radius, and many of them landed on top of me.
That must have been almost a terrifying experience.
It was terrifying, of course. But that's why I say I was brought out of the darkness into the light, and it changed my life forever.
I was intrigued by the fact that you were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the former Swedish Deputy Premier Per Ahlmark in 2006, and that you were the lead outside investigator for a group of law firms representing the families of 9/11 in their successful lawsuit against the Iranian regime. You must have really had a tremendous knowledge of what was going on in the region.
You know, I began as an old school reporter. I believed in going to places on the ground. That's why after I was released as a hostage, I went back to Israel. I went back to Lebanon. I went back to report on the Palestinians in the Bekaa Valley. I went to Iraq again and again and again during the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein blacklisted me at one point, and then ultimately I was brought back by their defense minister because I was one of the few war correspondents who actually knew something about their defense equipment and their defense programs. I was writing for defense magazines at that time. It's just given me an insight into the region, which I don't think you have. So in 87, I started a newsletter. I subscribed to something that you probably remember, Mr. Speaker, called FBIS. These were these little blue books of Foreign Broadcast Information Service. So the CIA would translate radio takes and things on TV from obscure little places in Isfahan and other places in Iran. And I noticed in 1987, they said, well, there's a Pakistani nuclear scientist coming to Iran on a consulting agreement with the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, and his name is Abdul Qadir Khan. Well, when I saw that, the lights went off in my head, and I said, well, Abdul Qadir Khan is the father of the Islamic bomb in Pakistan. Why would he be going to Iran? And I started to look into it and look into it and look into it, and it turned out that he is the man who perfected centrifuge enrichment technology outside of the Western world. So he did it for the Islamic world and became what we called him, the chairman of the board of Bombs Are Us. And so I began to write about it. I actually went to one of the air shows in the Middle East. I've got hanging in my office a shopping bag from Abdul Qadir Khan. It's one of my little trophies, unusual trophies. But he was the man who built Iran's uranium enrichment program. And I wrote about that in the late 80s, the early 1990s. And finally, Per Ahlmark recognized that. And he said, look, if the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, gets a Nobel Peace Prize for belatedly going into Iran after everybody was pushing them to look at what the Iranians were doing, Ken Timmerman deserves it because he was one of the first to actually expose what the Iranians were doing. So it was for exposing the Iranian nuclear weapons program early on.
You've been looking at the Iranian program for over 30 years.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Do you really think after all that effort they don't have a bomb?
Well, an actual nuclear explosive device, I don't know. I think if they had one, we would know it because they would have used it. I think what they do have, and I'm convinced that they have all of the non-nuclear components. And by the way, it's not simple. Some of those non-nuclear components are really not trivial. And they've developed that over many, many years. We knew it from the IAEA in more recent years, but we also knew it because of Mossad and one of the most extraordinary intelligence coups, I think, in the history of modern day intelligence, where, the Israelis send this team into Tehran and they find the warehouse in the southern part of the city, a nondescript area. They go in at 11 o'clock at night. They penetrate the warehouse. They find there are 2 containers inside full of these floor-to-ceiling safes. And they crack the safes. They get all the stuff out, and they get out before dawn. And they get out of Dodge, and they bring it out, and they've got 500 file boxes. And it's the entire nuclear archive of the Iranian regime. And they prove it from A to Z. They show exactly what the Iranians have been doing. So we know that the Iranians have mastered all of that very complicated physics of exploding, packing the conventional explosives around a nuclear core and detonating it. We know that they know how to do it. We know that they've produced the neutron initiators and all that other pieces of equipment. The last piece is just putting it all together. And the actual putting it all together doesn't take all that long. So that's why you had even the IAEA recently, and this is incredibly serious, and the Biden administration just doesn't pay any attention to it. Biden and Harris couldn't care less. The IAEA said recently, the Iranians now, they have enough fissile material, nuclear explosive material, to make 5 warheads within a week and 15 within 5 months. 15 weapons within 5 months.
And I take it your sense is they'll use them.
My sense is that they're going to test first. I think they will test, although they could test in a real life situation, which is what everybody's afraid of. But my guess is that they will test first. They will try to make everybody believe that they are now a nuclear weapon state. And therefore, if you attack Iran, you could have a nuclear weapon coming back at you.
If you were the Israelis, would you gamble on their being primarily using it as a counterforce measure to protect Iran, or would you be worried that they would actually offensively use it?
I'd be absolutely very, very concerned that they would use it offensively. Remember, this is a regime that has declared its very goal is the extermination of America and the extermination of Israel. We are the great Satan. People forget that sometimes. They think that the Iranian regime only cares about Israel. No, they care about us as well. And they have said, we will exterminate America and exterminate Israel. There's a story that our listeners might not know, and you might not know it either, Mr. Speaker. Ahmadinejad, the former president, who was very well known around the world, when he took office in 2005, he held a meeting of all of his cabinet ministers, and he said, we're going to dedicate this administration, this new government, to ushering in the Mahdi, the 12th Imam of Shiite Islam, who is going to come and lead us to Jerusalem and bring in basically the end of the world. I'm not making this up. His first act was actually to make a new 4-lane highway from Tehran to this well in Jamarat, outside of the city, where the Imam Mahdi was supposed to have been occulted. In other words, he disappeared in, I think, AD 943. And they took their pledges, they wrote them on pieces of paper, and they dropped them down the well. This is the way this regime thinks. They don't think the way that you and I do.
Well, I always ask my liberal friends, when you hear the Iranian parliament chant, death to America and death to Israel, what do you think the subliminal message is? I'm sure they have some convoluted explanation of what the Iranians would really do, although about 3 months ago, the Ayatollah Khamenei went on national television and said, I want to reassure you, death to America is not a slogan, it's a policy. As a historian, I take that very seriously. I want to take you on a detour because you ended up in 2012 running for Congress in Maryland's 8th District. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, first of all, I learned that Chris Van Hollen, who was the Democrat incumbent at that time and now the senior senator from Maryland, is a pretty scurrilous individual. He was also anti-Israel and pro-Iranian. And he tried to pretend that he wasn't. He would show up in liberal synagogues in this district, but everybody knew that he hated Israel. And I put out a 16-page newsletter on his record on Israel. Didn't support Iron Dome, wouldn't fund Iron Dome. He appeared at J Street. He sent his daughter actually to study in Ramallah in the West Bank as a young woman. I didn't put that in the newsletter. I thought that was too personal, but we learned that as well. And we made 15,000 copies of this and put a copy in every single mailbox of every household in the Jewish areas of our district, which were very well known. And I knew all the rabbis there. We became very good friends. Van Hollen was absolutely furious. So that was a fun little takeaway.
By the way, did it have any impact on their votes?
Well, I won those Jewish districts, which had never voted Republican before, those precincts. So lost the election, but I at least won those precincts. But the other thing, which was a bit pause for thought, was that we had problems with the election machines, the voting machines in Maryland at that time, 2012. And we had reports on election day. People would call us up and say, you know, I voted for you, and it switched to Van Hollen. I voted for Romney, it switched to Obama. And we looked into this. In one county, we actually got the election officials who were appointed by Republicans to show us what was going on with the machines. And they said, yeah, we had a problem with one particular machine. And we had a computer expert who looked at it. He said, yeah, but that could have been replicated to all the others. And they said, oh, no, but it didn't. We took it to the boards in the other counties, and even the Republicans just pushed it away. We did a after-action canvassing of one particular machine, where I think Van Hollen had, 70% of the votes in the machine. And it turned out that half of the votes that he was supposed to get were cast by Republicans and independents. We went to the houses and they said they voted for me. We never were able to resolve that. So that led me to write a book called The Election Heist that I published in February of 2020 as a fiction about the 2020 election.
The Election Heist.
The Election Heist. And I gave it to the president after the election in West Palm at his golf club. He said, "Oh, the election heist."
We will have to include a link to that in our show page so people can get a copy. I assume it's still available.
But it was a fiction, not a fantasy.
It turned out, I think, to have a lot of truth to it. Now, after you ran, you went on to be a guest lecturer at the Pentagon's Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy in Quantico. What was that like?
It's interesting. I had, quote, students listening to my lectures on Iran and about Iranian culture and about the Ayatollah and about Shiite Islam. I had people from all across the intelligence community, and to a man or a woman, they were all happy to tell me who they worked for, except the people who worked at the agency. And either there weren't any students from the agency or they just didn't want to talk to me. Because one of the stories I told them, it was a kind of long lecture. One of the stories I told them was about a defector that I had worked with, an Iranian defector, debriefed for this lawsuit against Iran for the victims of the 9/11 attacks that we won, actually. We won the judgment against them in a New York district court. And this defector came out in July of 2001, defected to Baku in Azerbaijan, met with the CIA, said, "I have documents that show the Iranian regime is cooperating with, quote, Arabs in Afghanistan." They didn't call them Al-Qaeda. Arabs in Afghanistan. A massive attack on America. They're going to use airplanes, commercial airliners as weapons. They're going to hit the Pentagon. They're going to hit the CIA building. They're going to hit the World Trade Center. And they're going to attack the White House. And, oh, by the way, it's going to take place on the 20th of Shahrivar. That's the Persian calendar date. So CIA George, who's there, taking notes, he takes out his Persian calendar and says, "Oh, well, you mean the 10th of September. Why don't you come back then when you have a better idea what's going on? Here's $300. Now get out of my life." Well, it turns out, and I didn't know this at the time, and my guy didn't know it either. Turns out that the 20th of Shahrivar was, in fact, the 11th of September. So he gave the CIA a forecast with documents to support it about the meetings. So what had happened, they brought al-Zawahiri, the number 2 of Al-Qaeda, to Iran before the attacks in May of 2001. They brought bin Laden's son there.
And what date was this meeting with the defector?
So the meeting with the defector in Baku was the 26th of July, 2001, over 6 weeks before the 9/11 attacks. And they just pushed him away. So the agency hated me ever since. You asked me about JCETA, so they probably never showed up. I told that story to these people, the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy. And finally, a woman came up to me at the end, and she'd been kind of quietly listening to my talk at the back. And she said, "Well, I'm not Deputy Director of National Intelligence in charge of the Iran file." I said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And she said, "Yeah, we used to think that the Iranians, because they were Shias, could never cooperate with Sunni terrorist groups, especially Wahhabi groups like Al-Qaeda, right? The Saudis. But we're starting to change our view on this, and we're starting to review our holdings from pre-9/11 to see what we missed." And even in the 9/11 Commission report, and that's actually how we started our lawsuit against Iran, even in the 9/11 Commission report, they discovered that there were 75 intercepts from the NSA in particular, showing 8 to 10 of the Al-Qaeda muscle hijackers traveling from Beirut and from Damascus to Tehran, and from there into Afghanistan, so they didn't get their visa stamped.
I'm now convinced the system is bad enough that we have to talk about national survival, not national security. Because I think national security is too soft a term and allows us to shrug and say, well, whether it's defense contracting or the intelligence community, we'll somehow muddle through. I don't believe that's true. I think it's much sicker and much deeper. Having this chance to talk with you today is almost perfect. This apparent leak of Israel's plans. Now, my personal belief, given that Mossad was smart enough to have a multi-year campaign to substitute devices and then come back and substitute radios and then have thought it through enough that when you couldn't communicate with each other, the leadership had to physically come together, which then created a target base. Or that Mossad thought far enough ahead that they'd actually planted a bomb inside the VIP guest house so they could take out one of the leaders of Hamas. When you look at that level of subtlety, my personal hunch is that everything they sent us is a lie. And that they actually might not mind it being leaked, A, because it will prove to the country how totally incompetent our current security system is. B, because I suspect if the Iranians read carefully the stuff that's been leaked and respond accordingly, that in fact the Israelis intend to do something radically different than what they gave us.
Very interesting. That's a very interesting thesis, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think anybody else has really gone into it in that level of detail or insight. You know, one of the classification markings on one of the documents with FGIISR, which means Foreign Government Information Israel, which means that some of the information, and it was particularly the information about the rocks, the particular bombs that they were loading, the missiles they were loading, apparently came from the Israelis themselves. That kind of supports what you're saying, is that it might have been what a certain spy novelist used to call a barium meal. You put out some information, part of it's true, but part of it is not true, and you put it into the system to see who bites and who sends it off, and that way you have a kind of radioactive trace.
It raises a question which I've been working on for almost a year now, which is the level of Iranian penetration of the Biden-Harris team. It is stunning, going back to the Secretary of State's high school relationship with one of the leading pro-Iranian operatives, who also was at Harvard with Obama. I mean, you start looking at these relationships, and it really does begin to be like a spy novel.
I write about that in the Iran House, and Philip Gordon, who's the national security advisor to Vice President Harris, he was also involved in this so-called Iran Experts Initiative. This was an effort led by the Iranian Foreign Ministry during the Obama administration to plant pro-Iranian experts in think tanks and in government. And so Philip Gordon, who worked with the current Secretary of State and with John Kerry on that nuclear deal in 2015, he penned op-eds with a woman named Ariane Tabatabai. She was part of the Iran Experts Initiative. Her emails were subsequently leaked. She was asking the Iranian foreign minister, should I go to this meeting? Should I go to that meeting? Should I attend this conference? She was asking him basically for advice on what she should do to promote the Iranian government point of view. She today is the chief of staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations.
It's insanity. It rivals or surpasses the Soviet penetration in World War II, where there were probably 500 agents at one time in the American government who were actually Soviet allies. Given that, what would you recommend the American goal should be in the new administration in terms of dealing with Iran?
Well, I actually published a piece for the America First Policy Institute about that, and it's a target-rich environment. I mean, the very first is to start by reimposing the maximum pressure sanctions on the regime, which were lifted by Biden on day one. Not only did he open the border, he also opened up Iran's oil exports. They went from 400,000 barrels a day to 2.5 million barrels a day today. That gave them an extra $100 billion. So that's a relatively easy thing to do. The president can issue an executive order on day one and reimpose those sanctions, which are already, by the way, in law from Congress. It's just that Biden waived them. Beyond that, I believe, we have to realize that previous policies, either of putting pressure on the regime or of giving them incentives. So the Republicans tend to put pressure. The Democrats tend to give incentives or to appease the regime. Neither of those has achieved their stated objective, which is to change the behavior of the regime. They will not change their behavior short of really dramatic actions. I think one of those dramatic actions, and I write about this in the book, was the killing of Qasem Soleimani. I think that was a tremendously courageous thing for President Trump to have ordered. It was important. It put the Quds Force, which was the Iranian regime's foreign expeditionary arm, on its heels. They have never recovered from that, by the way. And the rumor today is that his successor, Qasem Soleimani's successor, was an Israeli agent. So President Trump really did amazing work by ordering that assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So we need to do more dramatic things. And I think we should help the people of Iran to overthrow the regime, not with boots on the ground, not with military assistance, not in an Iraq-style effort, but things like giving them communications devices that they can use to keep those channels open when the regime turns everything dark and is killing people. Things like shaming the regime in international organizations, preventing the leaders from actually traveling to Europe and other places to cash in on their secret bank accounts, making sure that we delegitimize the regime. We don't treat them as a legitimate democratic elected government, as Biden and Harris have been doing. And I think if the people of Iran finally see that America is behind them, which they have never seen before, by the way, I think extraordinary things will happen. I also suggest we should appoint an ambassador to the free people of Iran, the president's special representative who will be the ambassador to the free people of Iran. Having worked with Iranian pro-freedom groups over many, many, many years, I can tell you that would have an incredibly dramatic impact on bringing people together if they knew that the U.S. government was finally serious about helping them.
In your judgment, what is the role of the MEK as an opposition force?
So I've known the MEK for a long time. Okay, a long, long time. I knew them first in Paris in the 80s.
Which is still the best place to know them.
Which was the best place to know them. Absolutely correct. That is true. My wife had the best take on them, Mr. Speaker. Right after we moved here and I met to meet one of their guys, we went together to go for lunch. And my wife came up and put out her hand as any normal person would. Oh, no, I cannot shake hands with a woman. Yani, Islam forbids it. They are Islamic Marxists. In the beginning of the revolution, people have short memories. It's over 40 years ago. They were on Khomeini's side. Their strike forces helped to round up and murder 3,500 military officers of the Shah's Praetorian Guard and of the army. They were with Khomeini until mid-1981. So they were with Khomeini for a year and a half, and then they had a falling out over what? Not over policy, not over the direction of the revolution, over power sharing. The Mujahideen, the MEK, wanted to be in charge, and Khomeini said, no, it's me. I'm in charge. And so their leader, Rajavi, he fled to Paris, set himself up in the outskirts of Paris in a place called Auvers-sur-Oise, and the rest is history, so to speak. But they are hated by the Iranian people for one reason in particular, and that is Rajavi sided with Saddam Hussein. He later moved to Iraq, set up camps in Iraq during that 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, tremendously bloody war. I covered it on the ground. It's just an amazing, amazing war. Horrible. It's a bit like Ukraine today, a long, hard slog. And Iranians don't forget Rajavi for standing next to Saddam, for literally kissing the ring, taking money from him, and invading Iran with Iraqi troops at his back. So they've never forgiven him for that. And I think that's kind of permanently exclusive. And the final thing is they have this 16-point plan for a future regime in Iran with, of course, their president-elect. They have a president-elect. She's already been elected, I don't know how many times by I don't know who, but she's president-elect. They call her that. And one of those points for this future democracy is that nobody who has had any relationship with either the Pahlavi regime, the Shah regime, or with the regime of the mullahs has any future in our democratic Iran. And I'm sorry to tell you, but you're not going to make a revolution in Iran today. You're not going to get rid of the regime of the mullahs if you don't draw on all of the elements of Iranian society, including people who are today in the regime, not reformists, but people who are keeping quiet, people who are businessmen, people who are investing money, trying to see how they can keep from getting in trouble, getting killed, getting their businesses shut down. Those people can be positive forces in the future. But if you adhere to what the MEK says, no, can't ever talk to them. They have no future in Iran.
Let me ask one last big thing, which is, if you were advising the Israeli government, what would your target list look like if they decide to really hit Iran hard? What does hard mean in dealing with a dictatorship like this?
I put it in the book because I gave it to them 15 years ago. It was a target list that was given to me by the son of the former head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps, one of those defectors that I talked to. And he said, look, you have to hit the leadership. And there's really only about 300 of them. There's not that many. And they get together every year at certain times in certain places. And we know where they are. And you can get all of them, all of them on a single day. And now it's public because it's in the book, but I also gave it to the U.S. intelligence community back in 2007, 2008.
Which, given the recent ability of the Israelis, both with Hamas and Hezbollah, you would have to believe that if they wanted to, they could pull that off.
I think they could. Plus, they know how to do it.
And the Iranians, having recently allowed Hezbollah to fire a drone at Netanyahu's personal home, probably set a new standard for how Netanyahu will think about hitting them.
Yes. You would like to think that that would be the same for President Biden, since the Iranians have made clear that they want to assassinate former President Trump. And they published a video online on Twitter before Elon Musk bought it in January of 2022, showing a computer-generated graphics of how they would attack him at his golf course. And, the view that they show in that video is exactly the view where that wannabe assassin, or the person, the alleged assassin that the Secret Service got before he fired his shots, he was in exactly the same place as you see in that Iranian government video.
I think it's virtually criminal that the Biden administration refuses to provide the level of security that kind of challenge. And while Biden has said a couple of things, and Speaker Johnson has been very clear that attacking a senior American politician would be an act of war. My view would be we would then have to eliminate the regime. Nothing short of that would be acceptable. And we have the capacity. We can find and eliminate the 300 top people pretty quickly if we want to.
Absolutely. And the thing is, the Iranians know it, but at the same time, they can't help themselves. I guess that's the good news, is that they are vulnerable should we ever get serious. Now, think about this just for a second, Mr. Speaker. What would the Middle East look like if this Iranian regime no longer existed? They are a poisoned arrow in the heart of the Middle East, supporting the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, groups in Iraq and in Syria. You take them away, and all of a sudden, lots of good things become possible.
First of all, you have a lot of unemployed terrorists who won't be able to get a check. I think that you would reset the entire region almost overnight into a dramatically more benign and survivable world. It would offset everything the Russians have screwed up in Ukraine in terms of strategic balance. Ken, this is a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, The Iran House, Tales of Revolution, Persecution, War, and Intrigue, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And our listeners can find out more about America First Policy Institute at americafirstpolicy.com. I really appreciate you spending this time educating us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Mr. Speaker. God bless.
Thank you to my guest, Ken Timmerman. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Iran House, on our show page at newtworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.